This is the Gauntlet, episode 124. My name is Lowell. This is part of our monthly series of one-on-one interviews with various designers and people in the industry and other such sundries. Today, I have with me Chad Walker, who is the author of Cryptomancer, which is a game I very much like, and it's a game that I ran for the Gauntlet Hangouts earlier this year. It is a striking game, and if you're interested in neat takes on fantasy, I really recommend checking it out. We're going to talk a little bit about it. But Chad's here because he has a Kickstarter that, because of the time of this recording, we think it's going to be in progress when we do this, because we're recording a little early because of the holidays. So we're going to get to that. Chad, you also wrote another game that I realized called Enoch that you had an ash can for.
Yeah, I'm a little embarrassed by that one, but we can definitely talk about it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me mostly because I see some themes running through your games there that we'll hit when we get back to Stigmata. So I want to start with Cryptomancer, and I want you to give me the pitch that you used, that you currently do when you're trying to explain what Cryptomancer is to someone.
Sure. So Cryptomancer is a kind of Tolkien-esque fantasy dungeon clearing romp, with elves and orcs and all the stuff we're accustomed to. It just happens to also be a game about information security, cryptography, networking, surveillance, and the overreach of a national security community. It's essentially the Edward Snowden story if people had pointy ears and chucked fireballs.
And where did that originally come from? What was the sort of point when you went, okay, I want to do this story about InfoSec, but in this context?
Well, thematically, it was triggered by, it was not long after all the Snowden story was coming out. And a lot of the discussions, like in the media with talking heads, had a really kind of uncritical view of what transpired when it comes to things like surveillance or things like maybe that type of like citizen resistance. And then also, I've been in the information security career path for a few years, and I really wanted a game that made me as a InfoSec person or a hacker happy. I wasn't comfortable with a lot of the abstractions a lot of games did when it came to hacking. I think it's fair that the gaming community thinks hacking rules are usually a really, really boring metagame in most games. So I wanted to fix that and also maybe educate people.
It's interesting because, when I first saw it, I was like, oh, okay, this is a cyberpunk take on fantasy. And then when I picked it up, I was like, oh, no, this is something very striking and very, very different from that. And there are a few changes to the world that you made, a few additions that you dropped in that I love because they're very simple bits that you dropped in, and then you deal with the implications of that. Can you talk about that with the shard net and the whole, key passphrase system that you have present in that game?
Yeah, so Cryptomancer is built with this kind of fantasy internet in mind, and it's really simple, but it's also informed by real life networking and crypto. The way it works is you have all your characters. They have these gems called shards. And a character can grab one of these gems and think something, and the thing they think is transmitted to other shards instantly, silently, and across massive spaces. So you can have instant communication as a dwarf in a dungeon with your other dwarf buddies at some clan hall 1,000 miles away. Now, anytime you have a communications network, you have security problems, namely eavesdropping. So if someone is listening in on that channel, you have some problems. That can be a big deal if you're planning an ambush or talking about performing some kind of caper. If your enemies compromise one of your shards, that's problematic. Then you have something called cryptomancy, which is basically magical cryptography. The way it works is you have two characters agree on a key phrase out of band, not over the shard net. And then you can use that key phrase to encrypt your communication. That means turn it into jumbled nonsense that nobody understands. And then the only person who can decrypt or translate that communication back to normal speak is someone who knows the key. So that's cryptomancy in a nutshell there.
And essentially, you've taken ideas about PGP and those sort of formats and stripped them down to some of the essential nature and made them gameable at the table.
Absolutely. You should actually, if you read the first couple chapters of Cryptomancer, you should totally be able to walk away and understand conceptually how things like public and private key crypto works. And I think that's a feat because that stuff's super complicated.
Mm-hmm. And that's a question for me. This is a game with, it's not exactly trad. It's a little more narrativist, but it's got some crunch to it, some level of detail. And then you've got the world detail. With those kind of layered things, what have you done when you've taught it to new people? What has been your approach to that?
I usually tell people to just rely on everything they know about generic fantasy conventions to begin with, and then make a couple little tweaks. So I'll say, yeah, the elves, they live in the forest, they shoot arrows at stuff, yada, yada, yada. But these elves happen to be engaged in some serious deforestation, so they can grow these giant bugs, flying bugs called gigaphids, so they can have aerial superiority over their foes. So yeah, it gets just start with the beginning, and then just add a couple of nuances that are sort of informed by, this modern, complex, weird world we live in today.
Have you taken it to conventions at all?
I have not. I'm kind of a hermit when it comes to engaging with the community.
Mm-hmm.
I don't game as much as I should. I certainly don't advertise as much as I should.
Yeah.
So not really. I've heard about other people's experiences playing the game.
Okay.
At conferences. One of the most striking ones was a guy said he was explaining the kind of crypto primitives of the game, and he saw the light bulb go off or go on above people's heads. And that was really satisfying. And so for me as a security professional who's trying to educate people, the fact that somebody who's not in the InfoSec industry using this game to teach this stuff to other people, that was like one of the best moments as a designer and an activist, I guess, in my career.
Beyond that, you've got what I know that you've published a couple of small supplements that have been free that at some point you need to make print on demand for people, bundle those together. You've had some people come to you and write some things, or did you reach out to people? What has been that kind of sort of response from the people who've picked it up?
Yeah, so there's 2 volumes. The first volume, I tried to make it open source and reach out to the gaming community and say, hey, if you have contributions to this world, or if you have something you want to see, let's talk about it. And either you can write it yourself or give me the ideas and I'll write it, so on and so forth. So the first one introduced things like essentially something similar to like a Bitcoin network. It expanded upon like the dwarven banking system and how to defend and attack that system. It did some other stuff too. But yeah, it was kind of a community outreach. And then the second one actually was in partnership with Mozilla, as in Mozilla, the browser.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So Mozilla, that organization is absolutely committed to all the cool stuff that a lot of IT and hacking people should be into when it comes to internet freedom, internet privacy, making the internet available to distressed countries, helping activists use the internet to navigate around and defeat brutal dictatorships. Like they're really committed to like that kind of thinking, and they want to support that kind of thinking. So we sort of established a relationship, and so they put up together an event where people came in and contributed to the second volume.
Oh, wow. That's really amazing. Now, you talk about the idea of teaching these principles through the process of gaming. It's a certain kind of media. Do you think there are other kinds of popular culture medias that actually get InfoSec right?
Generally, no. I think Mr. Robot would be probably the biggest example of someone doing it right. They still have to do a lot of shortcuts and a lot of abstractions, but generally they get the big picture and make references to using technology in the correct way, as opposed to a character in a movie saying something totally inscrutable about a worm while hammering on their keyboard and going into a cyber trance, right? So that'd be one. I'm sure there's a couple out there, but generally I was going after what I perceived as a gap in fictional representations of cyber.
Yeah, I have a story on that I hate to tangent, but I will. When I was dating my wife, she's a database analyst, database administrator, and I was like, oh, she likes computers. Let's go see this movie, Hackers. And Hackers is not a good movie, and she came away furious about the movie rather than being happy that we actually went out. So I've seen her react to that kind of stuff very, very badly.
Yeah, I think it's like watching a police procedural show with an actual cop in the room, or a lawyer show with an actual lawyer in the room. The security and IT people feel the same way about media perceptions of IT.
One of the things that strikes me about Cryptomancer, and feel free to agree or disagree on that, is that the mechanics itself, the set of roles that the characters make, tend to lean towards failure or incomplete success. I mean, the roles that we're making are pretty tough, and the resources we have to make those are difficult. Was that a kind of a conscious decision? Did it arise out? What was your thinking in that? Because it's a tough game.
Yeah, that's fair. So there's two approaches to that. Yeah, when you're making a character, you know, they're capable of great feats, but generally they're very vulnerable to a lot of things. And then from a meta perspective, the game is difficult because these characters are on the run and accumulating risk and will eventually be hunted down and destroyed by assassins for the state. What really informed that is the idea of whether you're a hacker who is into stealing credit cards or identities, or you're a political dissident who's fleeing from a brutal dictatorship and are using the internet to organize. At the end of the day, usually these stories of these hackers end really poorly. The reality is they end up in jail. They end up in a really bad place. But that's what makes, for me, the hacker story, you know, whether it's a modern story or this weird fantasy abstraction about crypto, that's what makes it really compelling, is that downward spiral, that inevitability of the state ultimately wins. But you know what? We're going to fight as hard as we can, as badass as we can, until our number's called.
It's really interesting because it is an inversion of the strongly heroic rising path that is in traditional RPGs. I think closest Powered by the Apocalypse certainly has loss, but you're still advancing, and there's not kind of an endpoint to most of those games. Have people, when they've seen that, what has been their reaction to that kind of built-in death spiral?
As you can imagine, there's been extremes of opinions. Some people are very pleased that there is a built-in ending that the players can sort of influence. And they also like fiction where you have your heroic mercenaries making their last stand, knowing they can't win, but man, it's going to be an awesome outro. And then on the other side, you have folks who say, what's the point in playing a game where you're ultimately going to lose against the big evil? And I don't have an answer for those people, and I think they game and want something out of gaming may be different from what I was designing for.
And I think that's fair. I like that analysis of it. Let me kind of switch gears then and talk about the game that you have coming up on Kickstarter. Now, had you kickstarted Cryptomancer?
I did not. And I think, you know, to your point about it being overlooked, I think that's the primary reason. Kickstarter is probably your number one media channel, you know, for a game. So
I think that's fair. So we've got SIGMATA with subtitle, This Signal Kills Fascists. So give us the pitch on that.
Yeah, so the game, it's a play on words. It's called SIGMATA.
Oh, SIGMATA, thank you.
But it's relevant to the stigmata, and we'll talk about that. But SIGMATA is an alternate 1980s dystopia about an American insurgency resisting a fascist government. And the players in the game play something called receivers, which are basically cybernetic revolutionaries that are powered by a special number sequence broadcast over FM radio towers called the Signal. So characters who undergo this transformation, they're experiencing the SIGMATA. And then, of course, when they turn into these cybernetic revolutionaries, they do all the things we expect from cybernetic revolutionaries in terms of kicking ass. and that might be being impervious to small arms fire, or maybe jumping into a television and coming out of another television somewhere else, or transporting over power lines, or controlling consumer electronics, that kind of thing.
So is part of the sort of meta story for the game understanding where the signal comes from, or is that an established fact in the fiction?
I've been toying with, I've certainly wrote it out, but I've been toying with leaving it out. So, when I think of some analysis of, like, let's say zombie movies or zombie shows, some people watch The Walking Dead and they're like, I just want to know where it all started. And I'm like, well, then it's no longer mysterious and awful. You've ruined the whole point, right? Like, why do you want to know? You should want to know, like, as a curious animal, but understand that if you find out, you've just cheapened the entire show, right? So I'm toying with keeping the signal mysterious, at least its origins.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Certainly for me, I like a good meta mystery. I like those kinds of things. So one of the things you mentioned on the Kickstarter page is, do describe it in passing as cyberpunk. How do you define cyberpunk, and how does SIGMATA fit into that?
Well, I would never want to put out a description or definition of cyberpunk.
Okay.
Because that is one of the most, in terms of like definition gatekeeping, people are very furious about defining and controlling what that means. Where I think SIGMATA intersects with cyberpunk is that it's a story about a resistance community using available technology. So that's going to be, in the 80s, it's going to be modems and bulletin board systems and floppy disks and payphones, so on and so forth. Using that technology to combat the powers. In this case, it's a brutal fascist state. And it's sort of a cat and mouse game between the state and the resistance over the technology. Mm-hmm. So for me, that sounds very cyberpunk.
I think that's fair. You mentioned some of the tools that they have at hand, and on the Kickstarter page, you also mentioned zines as a tool of information and underground movements and things. Are we going to see maybe some zine kind of presentations or props in the book?
It's unlikely there'll be that kind of meta prop. There's certainly going to be a ton of illustrations, and they're all done by the same artist, Ario Murti. And he's really just crushing that Akira meets G.I. Joe vibe, which is exactly what I was hoping for. Mm-hmm. But in terms, this isn't going to be a game where there's a lot of like Exhibit A or charts or that kind of thing. So,
is it the same mechanical-based system as Cryptomancer, or have you gone a different direction?
It is very, very different in terms of play from Cryptomancer. There is minor overlaps in terms of dice mechanics, but even then, things are very different. Like you said, Cryptomancer is relatively traditional in its approach. SIGMATA there are traditional elements, but it's far more story-based or narrative-based.
Okay. Well, talk, how are those elements, how do they integrate with the system?
So from a design perspective, one of the goals was to ensure that the players have far more mastery and influence over the story. So when I think about a traditional gaming experience, I'll build this character and I'll be just waiting for the game master to give me an opportunity to use my cool power, right? I will maybe make a cyberpunk character, and when I'm building this character, I'm envisioning them rappelling down ventilation shafts and sniping people through grates and, doing aerial backflips and snapping necks and, whatever, right? But when it comes to the actual play session, if the game master isn't providing these avenues, if they're not providing the ventilation shaft, right? If they're not providing this and that, or if the mechanics aren't conducive to you telling the story that you want to tell, that's a rough experience in gaming. It's like really unsatisfying. So I wanted to hand the players the opportunity to tell those stories, but also in a structured way where it's not becoming a little too gonzo. Mm-hmm. So I can sort of give examples. The primary mechanic is sort of you're rolling for successes, but the number of successes you get influences how much you get to own the story versus the game master. I'm not the first person to do it, but I'm doing that. So if you do really poorly, the game master is narrating the outcome of your role, but they're injecting elements of tension, stress, anxiety, and just heightening risk. Whereas if the player rolls and they do very well, they get to tell the story and the outcome and emphasizing how heroic and awesome their characters are. They also have control of the NPCs in the setting when they're telling this story. They're telling you, the game master, how the NPCs are reacting to what they did. So that would be one example of a more narrative approach.
And this is in part kind of a supers game. And that's often a challenging thing to write in RPGs. Certainly, they are often the most dense and complicated of systems. Even the story or story light ones often have a lot more details. So how do you picture this? How are you handling this as a supers game?
So it is a supers game in the fact that the players can really do some awesome, remarkable things. But the superpowers that the receivers have, that's what the heroes are called because they receive the signal over FM radio. If the signal goes down, they're now basically just humans, right? And so to keep the signal up, they need to make sure that the resistance is strong, that it's supported by the people, that it's supported by the international community, and they're not letting fringe elements of the resistance do things like commit acts of terror, for example. So there's this element of we need to play the strategic game to ensure that we control the airwaves, we have popular support, so we have our superpowers. And of course, if the resistance starts degenerating and they start losing control of the towers, now we're in trouble because we're taking on a militarized police force with APCs and gunships, and all we have are our pea shooters.
That's interesting. Certainly in Cryptomancer, we have a strong set of mechanical rules for handling the cells and the underground network and generating assets, and that as a kind of community that your characters build up at a higher level. So is that a parallel here in SIGMATA?
Yeah, there's two parallels. I wouldn't say it's as hands-on as Cryptomancer, where you're buying cells of agents and assigning them tasks to do while you're having your adventures. But the two buckets are, one, there's the strategic tracker, which is tracking how good your resistance fighters are, how much the local community loves you, and how much the international community loves you. And then to basically win the struggle, you have to increase those. You have to max those out. And if they go down, you lose the struggle ultimately. And then another nuance to that is there are 4 factions, political factions, that comprise the resistance in the game. Mm-hmm. And so you have to, 1, maintain their loyalty, 2, enact some strategic discipline when they start acting out, and 3, you don't want to lose them to the regime, because the regime is trying to win them over too, or at least get them to fight each other. So it's a little bit of trying to win the big war, but managing and disciplining the factions who hate each other.
So it seems like it is a game that shines for the long play rather than the short 1, 2, or even 4 shot.
Yeah, I would agree. This is it's going to depend on how the group handles things. But, the tracker for the 3 strategic paths that you're trying to win, they start at 5 and you're trying to get to 10. And it can go up and down depending on the various moves that the resistance and the regime and the players are doing.
Now, you mentioned the kind of cartooniness of the art, that sort of anime inspiration and the Saturday morning cartoons look and that. But we've got some pretty heavy things in here. Those 4 factions, they include some pretty radical elements, right?
Yeah. So yes, the art is what you say it is. And also some of the art is relatively extreme and offensive at first glance. If you don't have context, you'll see this regime propaganda poster and just be like, wow, that's really dark. That's really extremist. There are other pictures more offensive than that in the game. And again, it's trying to build what a government taken over by fascists actually looks like. Mm-hmm. But yeah, to your point about the factions, so in any insurgency, whether it's Let's take a modern example, Syria. The regime is always trying to paint the resistance movement as radical and extreme, or taking actions to make them actually radical and extreme. And the whole strategy behind that is to get the international community to say, oh yeah, those rebels are crazy. Those rebels are extremists. We better not give them weapons. We better not support them. And then when you cut off that aid, now the regime is better situated to win, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the factions of the game are a almost comic book representation of the absolute best and worst of the various factions that composed American political reality, whether it's the hardcore right-wing militias or the hardcore radical leftists or the hardcore evangelicals or the robber barons in Silicon Valley bros, right? It wants to present both the best and worst behaviors of those factions because that makes managing them and making them work together really hard and really exciting.
So one of the things here is, of course, you're setting in the 1980s and you talk about those factions, American political reality, and the 80s are a really difficult time because we have some real changes. We have the play out of Reagan era policies of the sort of racist justice system and that causing a whole series of problems. Of course, we have the Rodney King trial. We have that to sort of rising underground there. We've got women moving into more positions of power, but maybe getting co-opted by a commercialized space. So we've got a lot of that sort of real world analogs of difficult issues for marginalized communities in there. So what are you doing to bring that into play for your game? How are you bringing those voices in?
When it comes to the actual struggles of the 80s, not many of them are addressed explicitly. Ultimately, this is a game about what's happening now, and it takes place in the 80s for two reasons. And one of those reasons was I wanted to create maybe 3 decades of comfortable distance between politics and what's happening in the game. Mm-hmm. So it's a little more comfortable to talk about these things at the table without people being like, well, this is a game about Trump and that makes me mad. I wanted to get away from those kind of unproductive situations.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one reason for the 80s.
Okay.
The other reason goes back to the technology, and there's a little wind up to this reason. A couple years ago, when I was observing what was happening during the Egyptian Arab Spring, which really would end up being the core reason I made this game, the Mubarak regime, they killed the internet, and the Egyptian people responded by taking out their old 56K modems and connecting to a BBS system that was in Sweden so they could tell their story and share their tweets and do all this stuff, reach out to the international community. They smuggled in satellite cell phones because you can control the towers, but you can't control space. They busted out ham radios. They downgraded to all these low-tech communication means to circumvent what the government did, and they ended up winning. And I thought that was one of the most cyberpunk and awesome things ever. And so that is sort of the model that inspired this game. Now, the 80s let me sort of replicate that because in the 80s, you don't have the internet. And if you want to organize, you have to use these very analog channels. If you want to record an atrocity that the regime committed, you need to sneak in a camera or a camcorder and then get that film or that VHS to the right place and then maybe show it on a public access cable channel, right? Very different ways of thinking about organizing if there's no Twitter, if there's no Facebook, if there's no internet.
So much more like the technical challenges facing the protagonists in They Live and those kinds of movies.
Exactly. So many movies are so exciting because nobody can just pick up the cell phone and make it all go away, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to tap into that, but still in a, quote, high-tech era.
So is this game, Cryptomancer, we talked about the death spiral to it, that you're fighting against a regime that in Cryptomancer you're not going to win. Is there a similar pattern here, or is it more open?
It's definitely more open. I hope people win. And I hope game masters make them earn it. Part of the reason that Insurgency Tracker exists is that if players adopt a traditional murder hobo path to solving problems, the resistance loses. Because if you're lashing out and killing every soldier with guerrilla attacks and burning down buildings and doing this psychotic behavior we've come to expect from gamers, the international community says, wow, the resistance is a bunch of crazy extremists. And the local people say, wow, the resistance is a bunch of local crazy extremists. We're not going to hide them. We're not going to provide them safe houses. When we see them, we're going to call the authorities because we're afraid of these jerks.
Another thing you mentioned in the Kickstarter, to kind of shift gears a little bit, is the sort of references to 80s culture and 80s elements. And I just mentioned They Live. What do you see as the other touchstones for the game?
In terms of film, 3 that jump out is going to be RoboCop, Red Dawn, and War Games. I'll elaborate a little bit on those. RoboCop is a dark satire, and it presents a really dark vision of a corporate, borderline fascist police force that is kind of like unquestioning. And it also presents, at the same time, this view that, like, cops are the best in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very nuancy, right? And also it features this, awesome robot who fights crime. It's fun. For Red Dawn, the parallel is pretty similar in that this is a scrappy group of people who are resisting a communist invasion of America. It's an insurgency story. It's very hokey and embarrassing in many ways, but it's also very ahead of its time in many ways. And then lastly, War Games. War Games is considered one of the best, if not the best, hacker movie because it actually has some of the most realistic scenes of technology and hacking ever. And it also plays with that whole Cold War, anti-Soviet fear, Milo. So yeah, those would be the film touchstones. And of course, Akira stylistically,
mm-hmm.
because these are heroes that transform in shocking and violent ways. And now the state's chasing them and it's, et cetera.
I'm glad to hear you say that because I'm always nervous when people say about touchstones that it doesn't sound like you're falling into the trap of, say, Ready Player One, where it's just kind of pop culture masturbation and just. So I like that it sounds like it's integrated into that. One of the things I noticed is that you have Jim Pinto listed as a stretch goal author and also that he's been helping you in terms of the Kickstarter process. How did you get into contact with him?
He's just very vocal on Facebook, and he's also sometimes very controversial. He just says what he wants.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of how I heard of him. But then I got more interested in if this guy's this controversial, how are his games? So I looked into his games. I eventually would be able to do a couple play tests of some protocol games.
Mm-hmm.
And those sort of expanded my consciousness in terms of what the gaming genre can do. It really opened up some cognitive windows that had been closed shut for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So for that reason, I sort of reached out and said, you're sort of influencing how I approach design. I'm making a game that will be extraordinarily controversial and potentially start some really productive conversations. Are you interested in kind of supporting this? So he's going to do the graphics and the layout.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good.
And that's something I'm really bad at, and that's something he's good at. So it works out perfectly.
Did you do the layout on Cryptomancer yourself?
I did, yeah.
I think, you say you're not very good at that, but I think that book actually looks quite good. And for a first product, I think it looks effing amazing.
I appreciate it.
So is there anything else you want to say about SIGMATA that I haven't touched on? I
think one thing that might be worth discussing is that at the end of the day, this is a anti-fascist piece of advocacy.
Mm-hmm. And you explicitly call out neo-Nazi organizations in the text of this.
Absolutely. And so there's many goals of this game, both from a design perspective and a political perspective. One of the many goals is to have folks understand that our resistance movement is always going to be messy, and there's no one monolithic way to fight back. And even the groups that are fighting back against a fascist regime, they're not going to agree on tactics. So, to folks who maybe are pearl clutching when they hear about Antifa people punching Nazis or doing stuff that maybe they think is bad for the cause. Just know that there's different types of resistance models. And honestly, a lot of those folks are maybe chasing legitimate Nazis out of towns, as the rest of us, armchair general and judge on Twitter and Facebook, not actually fighting for a cause. So that's just one last thing I drop.
Wow, a pretty heavy note to end on, but thank you. I appreciate you bringing that back around to that. That will bring us to a close of another episode of The Gauntlet. If you need to follow along, or if you want to follow along, or even want to game with us, you can check out our Google Plus community. We have many games on the calendar for the Gauntlet Hangouts. If you want to find out about new podcasts coming out or chat with the community, of course, can find us on Google Plus under the Gauntlet. Both of those are great sources to check in on what we're doing. We have a lot of great games, and we're opening things up even more in 2018. We also have a Patreon. If you're interested in supporting us, we would appreciate that. That's optional, of course. The podcasts like Plus One Forward, Discern Realities, Fear of a Black Dragon, those are all free of charge. We have lots of Patreon levels, including access to the amazing Codex scene that is done, that has a dungeon world and new games and all kinds of great stuff in it. Also, of course, you can watch our games. We have many posted on our YouTube channel. You can go to the Gauntlet YouTube channel. There's some playlists curated, games that I run, that Jason runs, and a lot of games from the recent Gauntlet Con, including games at panels. So please check that out. Chad, thanks again for coming and talking to us. I'm really fascinated and looking forward to this game.
Thanks, Lowell. I really appreciate it.